Welcome to the Mark Peterson Show, where news and current events collide with parapolitics. In today's show, we're going to talk about Space Force, alien confirmation, or billionaire Star Wars. On June 18th, President Trump called for the creation of a Space Force, the sixth branch of the military. Space Force, as the name implies, will protect Americans from space-based threats. Is this announcement of a Space Force a subtle confirmation that there may be an extraterrestrial threat to Earth-based life? Or maybe, just maybe, the creation of a Space Force is an attempt to get back at Jeff Bezos, that rich guy that owns Amazon and the Washington Post, which has been somewhat critical of the president. Now, though Elon Musk has gotten all the headlines as it relates to space, with his attempt to colonize Mars and reusable rockets, and, he has enough money to even launch a car into space. But Jeff Bezos has quietly built a tourism business called Blue Origin. And space is going to be that next wild west where corporations, if they get their way, are going to set the rules for commerce like they did during the early days of the internet. Right? No taxes on sales on the internet, and I'm sure they'd love that rule extended into space. A Space Force, like the other branches of the military, would extend America's sovereignty and the reach of the IRS into space. And President Trump may have a special motivation to make sure that Jeff Bezos doesn't get a free ride like he thinks he's getting off of the United States Postal Service with the cheap shipping for Amazon. Now, on May 18th of this year, for those of you who don't know, the Washington Post broke a story that said the president had met with the Postmaster General and had convinced him to raise the rate on Amazon and other internet shippers who were using the post office to deliver their packages. Some said in an apparent political retaliatory reaction to what was written in the Washington Post in that month and in prior months about the president. Well, in this episode, we're going to explore the tangled web of Space Force. Now, as I mentioned, on June 18th, President Trump ordered General Joseph Dunford, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to immediately, and I quote, immediately begin the process necessary to establish a Space Force as the sixth branch of the armed forces. Now, today, the Air Force oversees about 90% of the military space activities. And some believe that's where the dysfunction starts. Too much bureaucracy, having too many functions under one umbrella. So the president has called for a separate Space Force, which some believe will replicate the functions and duties that may be already covered in the Air Force. If you have a Space Force, it's kind of tricky to figure out what this Space Force is going to do, and if it's going to cost us a ton more money on top of the money that's already being spent on terrestrial wars. Needless to say, the limitations that we've already boxed ourselves in based on the international treaties that we've signed, including the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which limits us to looking at space as just a public good, much like Antarctica. We can do research there. We can do environmental testing, but we can't look at Antarctica or space as a battleground. On top of that, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 prohibits the launching of weapons of mass destruction, like nuclear weapons, in space. It also prohibits military bases and maneuvers on the moon. Now, we know what maneuvers can mean and how they can be perceived as threats just based on what we've read recently with what has gone on in South Korea and North Korea with the maneuvers that we perform annually with South Korea being perceived as threats to Kim Jong-il and all of his buddies in North Korea. So we're prohibited from doing those kind of quote-unquote military exercises and maneuvers on the moon. So what would a Space Force really do? Before we dig into that, we have to understand that this is not the first time that we've actually pushed for a Space Force. As far back as the year 2000, Donald Rumsfeld recommended a Space Force. But the attacks of September 11, 2001, which launched long wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, sidetracked the effort to establish this spacefaring fleet to protect the planet. Now, if it was being proposed back in 2000, 18 years ago, what was the perceived threat? Some of you who are my age may remember President Reagan's SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, which was to establish a military missile defense system to protect the planet. Now, that was supposed to have never happened because it didn't get the funding needed to launch all of the programs, but it had some pretty interesting technology to knock out missiles from foreign countries or terrorists who were seeking to launch them at the United States. Smart rocks, dumb rocks, different types of weapons which would thwart missile launches intended at the United States. Many people were highly critical of the SDI program because they thought it destabilized the current operating philosophy at the time, which was MAD, mutual assured destruction. The argument was that at the point where our enemies perceived that we would get an offensive threat in space capable of knocking out their missiles, they would launch before we could achieve that advantage because it would make war winnable by the United States. And so that was debated throughout the 80s, and many of the investments made in SDI, some believe, ultimately got deployed. And then we went silent for a number of years. So what brings back the rationale to rethink the Space Force? Well, House members Rogers and Cooper of the Armed Services Committee have stated that they believe the Russians and the Chinese have gained peer status to the U.S. when it comes to space-based initiatives. And they base that on the Chinese being able to knock out satellites from Earth, which they did late last year when knocking out one of their own communication satellites with a terrestrial-based missile to prove their point. There are some who say that this is just another attempt by the industrial military complex to grow their budgets. The current U.S. Defense Department budget is $600 billion. Creating the Space Force may be another way for the military-industrial complex to further enrich themselves. The dominant space programs that are being pushed forward by Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, and BAE Systems would double if a Space Force were approved and made an independent branch of the armed forces. According to spacenews.com, the space budget under the Air Force, which already controls 90% of all the space activities, includes $8.5 billion for investments in new systems, $5.9 billion in research and development accounts, $2.6 billion for procurement of satellite and launch services. The 2019 budget request by the Air Force for space-based activities is 7.1% more than what they requested in 2018. So what are you getting for all the money that the Air Force spends today on space? Well, some people think you're getting quite a bit, actually. There's a Project Hammer that is operated by the Air Force, and this program is in place to try to eliminate Earth-killing asteroids. So Project Hammer would use weapons, including nuclear weapons, if they can detect these asteroids from a great enough distance that they could use the nuclear weapon to either change its course or blow it up, eliminating the threat to Earth. Now, the closer these sorts of big rocks get to the Earth, blowing them up with nuclear weapons poses many threats, including very large chunks of these big rocks hitting the Earth. So, Project Hammer, they got a big job. They're already doing it, and it's in that budget that I mentioned earlier. Some have mentioned Solar Warden. Now, Solar Warden is the code name for a secret space fleet that some believe have been in operation since 1980. Now, awareness for this fleet was hacked by Gary McKinnon, who broke into the defense servers and found that there were ship-to-ship transfers between a U.S. Space Command. McKinnon claimed to have seen spreadsheets that showed non-terrestrial officers and fleet-to-fleet transfers under the secret code name Solar Warden. So it sounds like a Space Force is already up and running. There's Project Damien, that's detecting and mitigating the impact of Earth-bound near-Earth objects. Now, to me, that sounds a lot like Project Hammer under a different name, but they are in the business, too, of detecting these Earth-bound objects, which could be big rocks or big spaceships, and mitigating their threat. So I would assume that that would include more advanced weapons for tracking things other than those non-intelligently controlled rocks that get near Earth. And then, of course, we all know about the Advanced Aerial Space Threat Identification Program. That's the Harry Reid program that just got written up by the New York Times back in December of 2017 that referenced pilots following and tracking a tic-tac type object that they couldn't keep up with and could not identify. They spent $22 million on this program trying to discover what these types of craft were. So if the Air Force is already doing a lot to protect us from big rocks and other near-Earth objects, and also tracking those objects that enter our airspace that we can identify, if they already have Solar Warden, which would be a fleet in space, what would Space Force do? Well, a couple of different articles I came across suggest that maybe they would protect satellites. As I mentioned earlier, the Chinese have already demonstrated that they can blow them up, and space satellites are becoming more and more important to the military for terrestrial battles. We need the GPS. We need to be able to coordinate troops and drones, and without our satellites, we are becoming increasingly vulnerable and susceptible for major gaps in being able to manage our military forces. So that may be one thing that they are called upon to do. What about building moon bases? Those research bases like you see in Antarctica, and protecting them. protecting trade routes. As we forge along, eventually some of these rich guys who have space programs will start mining asteroids and maybe even the moon, and there may be routes that have to be protected because those are the most efficient paths for delivering those resources back to Earth or to other places where they may be mined. How about protecting colonists? If Elon Musk succeeds in getting to Mars, there will eventually need to be a way to keep the peace and protect the colonists. Now, the treaty that I mentioned earlier prohibits us from fighting in space, but if we're going to get a space force, we didn't say a space helping hand. Space force implies the use of it. So I would expect that this force will become capable of orbital strikes. This one scares me because many of the scientists who were associated with Paperclip reported that Hitler wanted to weaponize space, to put giant mirrors in space to be able to focus the sun's rays and create energy weapons, essentially hold the planet hostage. And a space force could possibly do that. This group could also get in the business of knocking out these big rocks, these asteroids that would attack the planet, and maybe even running weather modification equipment. I know we don't like to talk about that in the weather modification that currently takes place, but in the future, lasers and other equipment in space could better manage the weather and improve crop efficiency and production. And these guys could be in charge of running that. But does any of that make sense? Would we risk a nuclear war by trying to establish space dominance at this point in time, when we already have fragile relationships and possible conflict with nuclear countries like North Korea? It seems like an impossibility that we would be pushing for a space force at a time when we're on a tipping point with a lot of terrestrial issues. Even the Pentagon is pushing back against the president and not requesting a space force. So with all of that opposition, why would we push forward? Some have claimed because there has been alien confirmation. Now, I'm not the tinfoil hat wearing guy. I love the X-Files just like the next guy. But there have been a lot of news in the last 4 or 5 years that would give you pause for concern. That would make you think that they are reacting to news that may not be big today, but may be big 5 or 10 years down the road. The Air Force was created a very short time after the 1945 Roswell crash. Could Space Force be in reaction to something that we just skimmed through in the news and talked about briefly, but had larger global ramifications? Here are some of the things that have popped up in the last 8 to 10 years. On July 17, 2012, astronomers detected a mysterious transmission of a radio frequency from a star that's very close to us. The Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico detected weird radio signals from Ross 128, a red dwarf located about 11 light years from Earth in the constellation Virgo. In November of 2014, the European Space Agency successfully landed their Philae probe on Comet 67P, which some claimed was not a comet at all, but a spacecraft. And then who could forget Oumuamua, the interstellar asteroid that ripped into our galaxy boomeranged out at a speed that was unthinkable and left us with the impression that it was a Battlestar Galactica-style ship because of the way it looked and was presented to us in the news. And then finally, the New York Times article, which all but screamed confirmation when they documented a pilot's reaction to a tic-tac-shaped object that it could not keep up with or track on radar. Could any of these be the equivalent of the 1945 Roswell crash that prompted us to create a new branch of the military to investigate these threats? It could be, but I tend to lean on the side of the Pentagon when they say they'd like to spend money on threats that are clear and present today. So why else would you spend this type of money? Well, because maybe you're participating in Billionaire Star Wars. Some of the planet's richest people are launching their own space programs. Do they know something that we don't? I'd say yes. They know how to make money. And they know the best way to make money is to do it where there is no government and no government regulations. That's why people love the wild, wild west when it was still wild. And that's why they love these tax cuts and everything that the president has done to reduce regulation. They get a chance to boost profitability and ignore some of the side effects that come along with reduced regulations, particularly air and water. So these guys, these 16 guys, the richest guys in the world, have all made some significant space investments, but there are 8 of them who plan to conquer space. Let's run down a few names. Richard Branson, Virgin Galactic, low Earth space travel. Elon Musk, we all know about this guy. Reusable rockets, launched a Tesla in space, plans to go to Mars and colonize it before he dies. Jeff Bezos, little under the radar, but the guy's putting big money into space. Blue Origin is a space travel company, but they're also building their own reusable rockets and plan to go to the moon and colonize it and mine it, along with various other asteroids. Mark Zuckerberg, hadn't heard a whole lot about him as it relates to space, but he wants to shoot small robots into space, including into the direction of Alpha Centauri, in order to find some of the space secrets that are out there. His effort is called Starshot Project. Jody Grelnick, the owner of Budget Suite Hotels, founded Bigelow Aerospace and is creating habitats in space. Kevin Casey, Microsoft co-founder, is the sole investor in Spaceship One, and they won the 2004 Ansari Prize. James Cameron, the guy behind Avatar. He invested in Planetary Resources, a company that plans to use robotic ships to mine asteroids. Kind of ironic because that's exactly what the guys were doing in Avatar that started the whole battle on the planet. Naveen Jain has invested in Moon Express, and they plan to also launch robotic ships on the moon and mine those resources that people estimate in the trillions on the moon. So given this level of investment, you can see why the government wants to create Space Force, so they can go collect space taxes and protect corporate interests before corporations create their own private security to protect their interest. How many of you watched the show Dark Matter on Netflix, where this group of mercenaries get amnesia on a starship called the Raza? Now, throughout the show, this team is constantly tracked and attacked by corporate armies who have dominated space and have created their own government. The corporations fight each other for control of space assets and technology, and there is no overarching government to maintain order. Without a space force, this could be our future. And so that may be the real driving force. These internet barons want to get their first crack at creating a space opportunity where there are no taxes and they can make billions more. But this may be personal. It may be personal. Jeff Bezos, one of the richest men on the planet, who also owns the Washington Post that has been very critical of the president, found himself recently in the crosshairs as the rates for his Amazon company were raised by the post office because some believe the president was upset with what was being written about him in the paper. A political retaliatory reaction. But this may go even deeper than that. This may go a lot deeper than that. At the International Space Development Conference, Bezos laid out his plan to go back to the moon. And he vowed to go to the moon with or without NASA. Bezos wants to mine the moon and asteroids and build a 24/7 solar energy company. Now here's where it gets interesting. Under the Bezos plan, Earth would be rezoned for residential use and light use. Let me say that again. The entire planet would be rezoned for residential use and then light use for creating energy. To make this happen, Bezos would need the cooperation of a one world government. A philosophy that stands diametrically opposed to President Trump's America First agenda. Now imagine what would happen if the entire planet was rezoned for residential and light use. What would happen to real estate value? Some people would make a tremendous fortune. Others would lose it. Last I heard, the president's wealth is based on real estate. And if you want to stop the richest man in the world from succeeding with a 24/7 energy company, you'd need a space force. Guys, I told you this show was about news and views and parapolitics. Don't get me wrong. These threats are real. Big rocks, non-terrestrial entities. But are these threats big enough to make you give up everything in order to achieve protection? 9/11 was horrific, but we gave up so much of our freedoms to get protection back. If we turn over space and give whatever government, whatever entity, full spectrum dominance over everything, we're locking ourselves into a fishbowl for where there is no escape. There will be 24/7 surveillance and very few places to hide. If I have to choose between the two worlds, the George Lucas Star Wars world where you have an empire trying to achieve total galactic dominance over a rebel group, or Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek world where people are choosing to explore because they want to face that final frontier and go where no man has ever gone before for knowledge's sake, I choose Roddenberry's world. We're constantly distracted by issues that never impact our rights and privileges. But issues like this can change the course of human history. So the next time you step outside and look up into the sky, realize that you have a voice and a vote to determine what ends up on our moon and in our skies. Do you hear those drums? That means we've reached the end of another show. The Mark Peterson Show, where news and current events collide with parapolitics. Want to keep the conversation going? Follow me on Twitter @Gorillapreneur.